Welcome to the other sky. You're watching our Fall Asleep to the Unknown series, where we tell strange stories that help you relax and fall asleep. Tonight, we'll take you back to the quiet pine woods of Suffolk, England, in December 1980, when odd lights and unknown flying objects lit up the dark sky over Rendlesham Forest. The Rendlesham Forest incident is often called Britain's Roswell. But what do you think? Was it just some lights and Cold War fear, or something way beyond what we can understand? Tell us what you think in the comments. Now, close your eyes and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Christmas Lights That Didn't Belong. Christmas in 1980 at RAF Woodbridge was expected to be calm. Most people weren't working and the forest was quiet, but that peace broke when strange lights were seen shining through the trees. What first looked like a normal plane crash became one of the most famous UFO stories in British history. It was early on December 26th, and many people were off for the holiday. Only the important workers were still on duty. Even then, the base stayed alert. These weren't normal British airfields. The U.S. Air Force ran RAF Woodbridge and its nearby base, RAF Bentwaters. They had American staff, equipment, and maybe even nuclear weapons, though that wasn't confirmed. The area around the bases was full of pine trees. Long lines of trees stretched out in all directions, right up to the base fence. During the day, it felt open, but at night the forest became dark and closed off. At about 3 a.m., something changed. A bright light was seen coming down into the trees just outside the eastern side of the base. It didn't fall fast like a star or flash like lightning. It moved slowly, like it was being carefully guided. At first, it seemed routine. Maybe a small plane had gone down. Crashes were rare, but not impossible. A group was sent to check. Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston, Airman First Class John Burroughs, and Airman Ed Cabansag were the first to respond. They drove along the edge of the base, heading toward the lights. When the road ended near a small gate, they got out and went on foot. The forest was silent and cold. Soft moonlight came through the trees, just enough to see where they were going. Their boots stepped on wet leaves. The air felt thick, not foggy, just heavy. There was an odd silence that Penniston later said didn't feel normal. They expected to see something broken, burning, or smoking, but there was none of that. Then the lights came back, red, blue, and white, glowing through the trees. They weren't high up, but close to the ground, maybe 1 or 2 meters, blinking slowly. Cabansag stayed with the vehicle to talk over the radio, while Penniston and Burroughs walked ahead. As they moved closer, more strange things happened. The air felt electric, like right before lightning. The birds were quiet. Nearby dogs started barking like crazy. In the distance, horses in their pens were nervous, walking around and around. Something was clearly upsetting the environment. Then, through the trees, they saw it. A solid object, standing still and silent, glowing with a slow, pulsing light. Later, Penniston would describe it as triangle-shaped, about 3 meters wide at the bottom and 2 meters tall. It looked metallic, but there were no bolts or lines visible. Its body seemed like smooth black glass. Lights glowed from underneath, spinning slowly. There was no sound, no heat, just light and stillness. They moved closer, carefully. But before they could reach it, the object started moving. At first, it moved slowly. Then it picked up speed. It slipped between the trees, fading in and out of sight without touching a single branch. Its motion was too smooth to be a helicopter or drone. It made no noise, no blades, no wind, only light. And then it was gone, lost inside the forest. Feeling confused and not sure what to do next, Penniston and Burroughs went back to the vehicle and reported what they had seen. The whole thing lasted just a few minutes. Their report was filed under unexplained lights in the forest. Officially, there was no solid answer. The case was left open. When they got back to base, no loud alarms were raised, no jets took off, no sudden lockdown. The event was taken seriously, but not treated as a threat. Still, within hours, the story started spreading. Not shouted out loud, not on the record, but quietly, shared in hushed talks behind closed doors. Something strange had happened in Rendlesham Forest, and more than one man had seen it. By then, the idea of a crash was already ruled out. No plane was missing. No wreckage was found. No distress calls had come in. Whatever those lights were, they weren't from any known aircraft, and they didn't crash. They moved around, floated, and then disappeared. When daylight returned, Penniston and a few others went back to the spot. Not just because they were curious, because it was their job. They had to check if anything physical was left behind. What they found gave the story a strange new twist. Deep marks in the ground, snapped tree branches, and radiation readings that didn't match the simple story of just lights in the woods. But that part would come later. This was only the first night in what would become one of the most talked about UFO events in modern military history. And while many cases are built on memory years later, Rendlesham came with something most don't have: real-time reports, audio recordings, official memos, and a base full of trained military men. And it all began with just 3 airmen, a quiet night after Christmas, and a forest where the lights didn't follow the rules. The forest didn't rest, not fully. Even when the lights faded and the patrol went back to base, something in the trees still felt off, like the night had taken a deep breath but hadn't let it go. By the time the sun began to rise, the trees stood frozen under a cold winter sky. No one was officially talking about what happened just a few hours earlier, but those who were there knew this wasn't finished. The morning of December 26, 1980, came without any answers. At RAF Woodbridge, the base seemed calm, but deep down, a quiet tension stayed in the air. The night before, 3 U.S. Air Force security officers had entered the woods outside the base. What they came back with didn't look like anything from their training. There was no airplane crash, no distress call, no wreckage, just a strange object giving off spinning lights. It moved without sound, then vanished deep into the forest. By early morning, Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston was getting ready to return to that same place, but this time with clearer orders and in daylight. He wasn't going alone. Several other men joined him, some from the security team, others from logistics and command. Their mission was simple: find the location, take photos, write down what they observed. The forest looked different in daylight. What felt confusing and packed at night now looked more organized. Rows of pines stood in long lines. The ground was coated in soft brown needles and hard frozen dirt. The morning air was cold and damp. Sunlight came weakly through the trees, shining in narrow streams across the path. It didn't take long to find the place. About 100 meters into the forest, they came across a small clearing. In the middle were 3 clear marks in the dirt, forming a perfect triangle. Each mark was spaced out evenly, about 12 feet apart. The dents weren't too deep, but they clearly showed that something heavy had been there for a short time. Penniston moved in slowly. He studied the marks, pulled out a notebook, and started drawing. He carefully measured how far apart the holes were and how deep they went. Close to one of the marks, small tree limbs were found broken, not decayed or old. They looked freshly snapped. Nearby trees also had strange black lines marked halfway up the trunks. There was no ash or fire smell, but the burn marks were real. One airman brought a handheld Geiger counter. It's a standard tool to check for radiation. It's not something usually used by basic patrols, but someone higher up must have approved it. As they scanned the area, the meter started clicking. Not high enough to cause danger, but more than you'd expect. Inside the triangle, radiation levels were clearly higher than the rest of the forest floor. Even stranger, the device jumped when held near one of the tree trunks. No one had a clear reason why. Penniston kept noting everything down. Then, as he walked closer to the edge of the clearing, something odd stood out. Pressed into the frozen ground were small matching shapes. They weren't footprints, and they didn't match any animal or boot tracks either. He sketched them and noted which way they pointed. Later, he would say they didn't look like they were placed randomly. While his team took pictures of the site, Penniston started remembering more about what he'd seen the night before. In the moment, full of stress and adrenaline, he had focused mostly on the lights. But looking back now, the object clearly had shape and structure. He recalled its triangle shape, the dull metal-like surface, and the strange smooth texture, like black glass. He also remembered the markings, odd symbols along the side of the craft, like glyphs or strange writing. But that detail wasn't in the first report. Penniston hadn't spoken about it right away, maybe because he wasn't sure, or maybe because he was being careful. But in his notebook, he began sketching the symbols from memory. He didn't recognize any of them. They didn't look like letters, numbers, or anything from the military. Years later, those symbols would become one of the most studied parts of the case. But on that cold morning, inside a quiet forest, Penniston simply drew what he saw. 5 strange shapes, all in a line just above eye level on the side of the craft. The team stayed at the site for over an hour. They took photos from every angle. Soil samples were collected. No one gave an explanation. Not the commanders, not the men on the scene. The only thing clear was that something strange had landed, or at least touched the ground. When they got back to base, only a few commanders were told about what they had found. There was no full alert, no outside teams, no news reporting. The whole response was quiet and controlled. Some airmen were told not to speak about what they'd seen. Others were just told to file their reports and forget about it. But Penniston didn't forget. In interviews years later, he kept saying the same thing. What he saw was not a normal plane, not a satellite, not a weather balloon. He said it was beyond known technology. It moved with no sound. It left marks behind. And to him, it seemed, as he put it, aware. But for now, there were no big headlines, no breaking news, just some marks in the dirt, strange radiation levels, and a small group of airmen struggling to make sense of something totally unexpected. And even though this first daylight check was important, it wouldn't be the last. 2 nights later, the deputy base commander would go into that same forest himself. And this time, the event would be recorded live, on audio, as it happened. But long before that moment, Penniston already had something more than just a memory. He had drawings, a field notebook, and, though it wouldn't come out publicly for decades, he claimed to take something else with him, a binary message, not sent through a device, but directly into his mind. That part of the story would be revealed later. For now, just the facts remain. Something landed in Rendlesham Forest. It left marks on the ground, changed the environment, and led to a focused, quiet investigation by the U.S. Air Force. Whether it was a craft, a probe, or something else, no one on the team could explain what they witnessed, and no one had found a reason to ignore it. The fog came just before midnight. It wasn't thick, but it stayed low between the trees. A soft, pale mist that covered the ground and turned shadows into shapes. It was the second night after the original sighting, and it arrived without noise or attention. Officially, the case had been noted, but nothing bigger had been done. No emergency, no lockdown. Still, those who had been out there before knew this wasn't over yet. December 27th, 1980. RAF Woodbridge was back to routine, at least on paper. Normal duties had started again. During the day, things seemed organized, and that morning's search had confirmed that something unusual had happened out there. But as darkness returned, so did a quiet sense of tension. The people who had seen the light said nothing. The ones who hadn't were now curious. Some, both on and off base, started watching the skies a little more closely. There were no new patrols sent out, not officially. But around the base, the mood was shifting. People were more alert, like they were waiting for something, or like they were being watched. Back in the nearby town of Woodbridge, a call came in to the Suffolk police. A civilian reported strange lights in the sky and a glowing object above the trees. The time matched perfectly with what some airmen said they had seen from the eastern side of the base. The police showed up, took down notes, and found nothing unusual. It wasn't their first strange report that week. Inside the base, a few airmen working the night shift quietly talked about movement in the woods. At one guard post, someone said they saw a red light flashing, coming from the same direction where the object had disappeared 2 nights earlier. Others didn't believe it. Since there were no orders to send a team, no one went into the woods. Still, the talk spread. Some said it looked like whatever had come before might be back again. None of this was written down in the official reports. But years later, in interviews, several men spoke clearly about that second night. Not because of what they saw, but because of how it felt. One phrase kept coming up. Something was wrong in the woods. One man, who asked to stay anonymous, said he went outside for a smoke during his midnight duty. He wasn't one of the security officers. He fixed equipment. But while standing near the edge of the base, looking out toward the trees, he noticed a faint glow. It wasn't bright, not like floodlights, not a spotlight, just something different, something strange. It was faint, like something behind the trees was giving off a soft white glow. He thought it might be car headlights at first, but the light didn't move. It just hung there for a moment, then slowly faded. Didn't report it. By that time, talking about lights in the woods had become a bit of a joke. Rumors were everywhere. Some said it was just the Orford Ness Lighthouse, almost 5 miles away. Others whispered that it was part of a secret test, experimental aircraft maybe. But no one could explain why the base itself wouldn't have been told. That second night, no one in command went back into the forest. But the next morning, something odd was found. The same clearing Penniston's team had visited now had new marks in the soil. Not deep, not clear proof, but they hadn't been seen the day before. Later, a short note was found in the base paperwork. It said that one of the younger airmen from the maintenance crew had gone into the woods after his shift ended early that morning. He never filed a formal report, but another man remembered seeing him return. His clothes were covered in frost. He looked pale, like a ghost, and wouldn't talk about what happened in the forest. These second night stories were never written into any official logs. There was no formal record, but something on base had definitely started to shift. The silence grew heavier. The airmen from the first night, Penniston, Burroughs, and Cabansag, weren't talking about it anymore. Some joked that maybe they got it wrong. Others pulled away and said nothing at all. This is the moment where the Rendlesham story changed. It stopped being just a weird event and became something more serious. A mix of mystery, pressure, and secrecy. Years later, multiple airmen who were stationed at RAF Woodbridge back then remembered what the base felt like in those days. Some said they were told not to talk about it. Others said no one gave direct orders. But the pressure to stay quiet was real. Whether it came from superiors or just from fear of being laughed at, the result was the same: silence. Off base, the general public didn't know any of this. The event wouldn't reach the news until years later. But local residents, especially people living near the edge of Rendlesham Forest, had started talking. A retired teacher said she saw a weird light above the trees on the night of the 27th. She said it hovered for nearly 10 minutes. She told no one back then. She was afraid people would laugh. That second night, though not well documented, became a major turning point. No big event happened. No chase. No photos. But the fog, the lights, and the strange feeling on base planted a deeper thought in the minds of those who had lived through it. If this wasn't over yet, was it building up to something? 2 nights later, that question would be answered. On December 28th, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander, would lead a team into the forest himself. And unlike the nights before, this one wouldn't rely only on memory. This time, Halt brought a handheld tape recorder. He planned to record everything as it happened. And in the hours that followed, that's exactly what he did. But before that chapter begins, the second night in Rendlesham deserves to be remembered for what it really was. Quiet, foggy, subtle, a night with no action, no contact, but still full of meaning. Because not all important signs come with noise. Some repeat themselves. Slow, careful, just strange enough to feel planned. Chapter 4. Halt takes command. By the third night, the event was no longer just a story passed around. People on base had seen the lights more than once. Strange marks had been found in the ground. Tools had picked up mild spikes in radiation. And the silence? It now felt heavy and real. People weren't staying quiet just to be professional. They were staying quiet because they didn't understand what this was. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt stepped in to take control. He was deputy commander at RAF Bentwaters. A skilled officer, not known for drama or wild theories. His job was to keep control, order, and focus. But he was also a practical man. After hearing the stories, reading the notes, and seeing how odd things had gotten, he made a decision that would shape everything still to come in the Rendlesham case. On the night of December 28, 1980, Halt picked a small team to join him. They went into Rendlesham Forest to see for themselves, and they didn't go unprepared. The team brought flashlights, a Geiger counter, radios, and most important of all, Halt's handheld audio recorder. He didn't just want secondhand notes. He wanted a real-time record of what they saw, felt, and experienced as it happened. They entered the woods around 9 p.m. Moving slowly down an old logging road, they followed the edge of the forest. The air was cold, almost freezing. The ground felt solid and tough under their boots. Their flashlights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, showing shiny frost on pine needles and frozen plants low to the ground. The forest was still and silent, just like on the first night. Halt started recording almost right away. His voice on the tape was calm, careful, almost like a doctor taking notes. He spoke as they moved. "We're now approaching the area where the object was sighted. The ground is frozen. 3 marks. Equidistant. Triangle." They had arrived at the same clearing found during the earlier search. The landing marks were still there. As the team scanned the area with the Geiger counter, the device clicked softly at first, then more often. The readings weren't high enough to be dangerous, but they were above normal, especially near the triangle-shaped dents. "We're getting readings of 0.5 to 0.7. That's significantly higher than normal," Halt said on the tape. And then something changed. While scanning the clearing, one of the team members saw a glowing red light in the distance. At first, it didn't move. A steady glow, about the size of a basketball, just over the tree line. They thought it might be a tower light or even a star, until it started moving. Halt described it on tape as the object shifted. "It's blinking. Moving toward us now, throwing off sparks, red, then blue. It's coming closer." They kept watching. The light moved between the trees, fast, sharp turns, no sound. It didn't float or drift randomly, it reacted. Halt's voice came through again. "Keep the flashlights off. Let's see how it moves." Then the light split. As they watched, the red glow broke into smaller lights. 3, maybe 4. Each one drifted on its own path, moving away, then coming back together as one. It wasn't like a flare. There was no smoke, no slow fall, no pattern from wind. Just silent motion, like it had its own mind. More than once, the team reported thin beams of light shining down from the object. Narrow shafts, like lasers, sweeping across the ground below. At one point, a beam appeared near the base's weapons storage area. Halt's voice, still steady, noted, "The beam of light coming down appears to be right in front of us." Again, there was no sound, no impact, just light, doing what nothing man-made should do. The team stayed in the woods for almost 3 hours. They watched the lights from different areas. They tried to follow them, but the lights stayed just out of reach, darting through trees or fading away completely. They never got close enough to touch, but everyone agreed. These lights weren't random. Over the years, the tape has been reviewed by both skeptics and believers. And while many theories have been offered, stars, satellites, distant lights. No one has matched those ideas with what's actually heard on the recording. Halt's decision to document the event in real time remains one of the most important parts of the Rendlesham case. Unlike most UFO stories that rely only on memory, this one has a live, unedited audio recording. No extra details added later, no guesswork, only a voice in the dark describing what is happening, step by step, moment by moment. After returning to base, Halt typed out a memo. It summarized everything that happened between the 26th and 28th. The memo was short, clear, and careful in tone, a report that would become a mystery of its own. For years, the memo stayed unknown to the public. But the tape? It existed from day one, and it still exists to this day. In a case filled with questions, rumors, and interpretations, one thing stands out. The deputy commander of a U.S. Air Force base walked into a forest to look into something strange. He saw something he could not explain, and he recorded every second of it, not to prove something, but because in that moment he knew it was the right thing to do. The forest was quiet again when they left, but whatever had come to Rendlesham wasn't ignored. It had moved in total silence. It had responded to their presence, and it left behind something more lasting than footprints or broken branches. It left behind a record. Chapter 5 begins. The Halt tape, a case recorded live. The sound of footsteps crunching across frozen dirt. That's the first thing you hear. Not a narrator, not music, not someone looking back years later, but the real sound of U.S. Air Force personnel walking through a cold English forest long past midnight. It's steady, calm, uneventful at first. Then comes the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. We're now approaching the area where the object was sighted, about 100 meters from the landing site. That one recording, captured on December 28, 1980, deep in the woods of Rendlesham Forest, has become the most watched and best-known piece of evidence in the entire case. Known today as the Halt tape, it runs just under 20 minutes. And it captures what most agree is a real-time military investigation of something unexplained. It's rare to have actual audio from any UFO case, even rarer when trained officers are the ones involved. But the Halt tape doesn't try to impress, it doesn't guess or try to explain. It reports, it observes, it stays calm. Halt uses a firm, steady tone to describe exactly what he sees and hears. And in doing so, the tape becomes a real window into one of the most studied UFO encounters in history. The recording begins shortly after the group enters the forest. The air is still and freezing cold. In the background, you can hear wind moving through the trees, but not much else. The team starts at the same clearing where the triangle-shaped marks in the ground had been found. Halt checks the Geiger counter. MHE notes the readings aloud. 0.5 to 0.7, maybe 0.1 in some places. That's what Halt says on the tape. The readings aren't extreme, not dangerous, but they're consistently higher than the normal background level. One of the marks in the ground shows the highest spike. It matches the same spot where Penniston had once drawn strange symbols along the side of the craft. That detail isn't mentioned on the tape, but later, people would realize how closely those two moments lined up. As the team moves deeper into the woods, things begin to change. One of the men sees a strange light between the trees. Halt calls it out on tape. A red light appears to be moving. Now it's pulsating. At first, They thought it could be a beacon or a lighthouse, but the way it moves doesn't match. The object glides side to side, pauses, then shifts again, like it's reacting to their movement. You can hear the uncertainty rising in Halt's voice, but not fear. He stays calm, focused, descriptive, not emotional. It's about 10 degrees off the horizon, appears to be dancing through the trees. This is where the tone of the tape starts to shift. One of the men says it looks like the light has broken into pieces. 3 smaller lights, moving separately, drifting apart, then rejoining. There's no sound, no engines, no rotors, no high jets above, just motion and complete silence. Then Halt narrates something even more startling. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam of light coming down to the ground. It lights up a small area, about 10 feet across. The team watches, but doesn't move toward it. Later, witnesses said it wasn't a spotlight from below. The light came from above, narrow, quiet, steady. They keep tracking the lights for more than an hour. At one point, Halt notes, "The object has moved near a field. Now it's stopped, rising again." They try to keep watching it, but the trees block much of the view. The object never gets close, but it doesn't act like anything they've seen before. It doesn't fall like flares. It doesn't glide like planes. It hovers, shifts. Sometimes it vanishes, then shows up again, just out of reach. Always silent, always distant. Eventually, the men begin walking back toward the edge of the base. Then, another important detail. Halt says one of the beams seems to aim at the WSA, the weapons storage area. He doesn't say much else. No guesses, no alarm. Only, the object is now beaming down light near the WSA. Years later, that simple report would launch a wave of theories. The WSA was where nuclear weapons were possibly stored. If that light was pointed at the WSA, was it a scan? A message? Just a coincidence? There's no answer. The recording ends without a conclusion. No contact, no sudden reveal. Just Halt's calm voice, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, and the stillness of the English forest returning. In the years that followed, the Halt tape was studied by audio experts, military researchers, and UFO investigators. No editing was ever found, no signs of tampering. The voices match real people. The background sounds match open forests in winter. The equipment used, including the Geiger counter, was standard issue for that time. Skeptics have tried to match the sounds and statements on the tape with things like distant lighthouses or bright stars and planets. But the problem stays the same. Nothing in the known environment behaves like the lights described on that tape. The fast movements, the way the light changed position, the way it seemed to react to the presence of the team. These aren't the qualities of fixed lights, reflections, or natural illusions. Even more important, the tape captures multiple people confirming the same things at the same time. In several places, you can hear 3 or 4 men responding to a light, a direction, or movement, not minutes apart, but within seconds of each other. That real-time agreement is hard to explain away. In the world of UFO encounters, the Halt tape stands out, and not because of what was said, but how it was said. There are no wild guesses, no dramatic reactions, no theories added in later. It's simply a military officer describing what he sees as it happens, just in case. And that's where it gains power. The tone in Halt's voice, the careful way he speaks, the discipline in how he records, moment by moment. He didn't walk into those woods looking for attention or headlines. He went in to document something strange. And in the end, he came back not with proof, but with questions. Questions he carried in his mind and in his pocket on a tape recorded under the soft sound of boots moving through the night. Chapter 6 begins: memos, debriefs, and binary code. By the time the final night of sightings had passed, the forest went still again. The lights were gone. No new beams touched down. The patrols ended. But inside RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, the sense of unfinished business still lingered. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt returned to base with his team and logged his notes. The radiation readings, the red light that split and reformed, the object that pointed a beam at the weapons storage area. All of it had been recorded, live, on his handheld tape. But while the audio stayed private for a while, something more formal had to be written. Something that could go up through military channels. That report would become known as the Halt Memo, dated January 13, 1981, just over 2 weeks after the events in Rendlesham Forest. The memo was a single page, its title, Unexplained Lights. It was addressed to the UK's Ministry of Defence, typed on official US Air Force letterhead and signed by Halt himself. But anyone expecting the memo to sound urgent or dramatic, I would be surprised. The memo's language was careful, simple, almost cold in tone. It gave a brief overview of what happened across the 3 nights, with no emotion, no guesses, and no bold claims. There was no talk of a craft, no mention of beams near the weapon zone, no radiation numbers, no tech analysis, no deep theories. Instead, Halt used calm phrases: unusual lights, ground markings, a possible landing. It read more like a weather update than a major military incident. Some would later suggest Halt wrote it that way on purpose, that keeping the tone low-key allowed the memo to move quietly through military channels, without setting off alarms, without creating headlines. Some believed Halt had been told to keep speculation out of the report, to only include facts that couldn't be challenged. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The memo was received, filed, and quietly forgotten for a time. It wasn't until several years later that the memo became public. A copy was released through a U.S. Freedom of Information Act request, and before long it landed in the hands of UFO researchers. Its plain wording only made it more interesting. Why would a senior military officer send a formal memo to the British government about unknown lights and landing marks, if there wasn't something more beneath the surface? By the late 1980s, both the Halt tape and the Halt memo had become key parts of the Rendlesham story. But just as public attention was increasing, another detail came out. This one far stranger. It came from Jim Penniston. Penniston had been one of the first men in the woods on the night of December 26th. His experience was short but direct. He had gotten close to the object, studied it, and, by his own account, touched it. That fact alone made his report stand out. But years later, he shared something new. He claimed that the moment he touched the craft, he received something like a transmission. Not in words, not in images, but in code. Binary code. 1S and 0S. He didn't understand it at the time. It came to him like pressure, something he had to write down. No thinking, no translation, just a need to put it on paper. The next day, Penniston opened his field notebook. the same one he used for military sketches, and filled multiple pages with rows of binary digits, no title, no explanation, just full pages, lines of ones and zeros. He didn't tell anyone, not at the time, not even during the first debrief. It wasn't until the early 2000s, during a television interview, that Penniston revealed the notebook in public. At first, many people didn't take it seriously. Why hold it for so long? Why wasn't it mentioned in the early reports? Penniston's answer stayed the same. He didn't think anyone would believe him. The sighting by itself was already hard to accept. Adding the idea of mentally downloaded binary code from a silent, glowing object in the woods would only make his story sound less believable. So he kept it to himself. Eventually, a small group of researchers decided to analyze the code. They entered the binary into a computer program using ASCII, a method that turns digital code into readable text. What it revealed were several short English phrases and a list of global coordinates. The phrases were unclear but strange. Exploration of humanity. Continuous for planetary advance. Eyes of your eyes. But it was the coordinates that caught attention. When plotted on a map, they pointed to the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the Nazca lines in Peru, the Temple of Apollo in Greece, and one strange entry, a spot west of Ireland linked to legend, a place called High Brazil, a mythical island said to appear once every 7 years, seen in old sailors' maps and Irish folklore. Skeptics immediately questioned all of it. Has the binary been faked? Added later to the notebook? Reverse engineered to match known historic sites? Penniston denied every accusation. Penniston insisted the notebook was real, unchanged since the day he wrote in it. He called it a simple record of something he never fully understood. The U.S. Air Force never commented on the code. Neither did the British Ministry of Defense. There was never a formal statement, and no official analysis was ever released. Even today, the pages of binary remain one of the most debated parts of the Rendlesham case. To some, they're just an afterthought. To others, they're the message, the point of the entire event. But setting the code aside for a moment, what's left is this. A U.S. Air Force officer sent a memo to the British government about unexplained lights in a quiet forest. Another officer recorded those lights as they moved, split apart, and, possibly, scanned the base using tight beams of light. A trained security sergeant claimed he made physical contact with a smooth, silent object, one that left marks on the ground, burns on nearby trees, and possibly something else inside his mind. This mix is what makes Rendlesham so hard to explain. It's not one story, not one sighting, not one set of footprints. It's a layered multi-night encounter with physical traces, official paperwork, and live witness testimony, still unfolding even after 4 decades. And yet, despite the memo getting filed and the tape being safely archived, there were no public statements, no visible investigation, no teams were sent in, no conclusions shared, at least none that anyone has ever seen. Chapter 7. Military Reactions and Official Silence. The morning after Colonel Halt's forest encounter, everything on the base looked normal. Trucks crossed the runways, the dining hall opened on time, shift rotations returned to their usual pace. But behind locked doors, the feeling was different. Officers who had once laughed off the first night's reports weren't laughing anymore. Too many voices, too much strange detail. And now, part of it was on tape. Colonel Halt returned just before dawn on December 28th. He was steady, but clearly rattled. The men with him, Lieutenant Bruce England, Sergeant Monroe Nevels, and others, all carried the same look, something between disbelief and quiet urgency. They had seen something, and it wasn't in any training manual or response protocol. Now came the hard part. What do we do with this? No alarms were raised. No immediate reports were passed to higher command. Instead, the base entered what some would later call an administrative lockdown. Word began spreading. No one was to discuss the event. All reports stayed within official channels. Nothing was to reach the media. Inside RAF Bentwaters, the base commander, Colonel Ted Conrad, reportedly reviewed the early notes from Halt, but stayed removed from the details. In military procedure, any airborne unknown, especially near sensitive sites, should have moved up the chain to higher branches like the Ministry of Defense, USAFE, or even NATO command. But this didn't follow normal lines. There was a report, there was a tape, but the follow-up vanished. But no one seemed in a hurry to pass anything up the chain of command. While things looked calm above the surface, something quieter was happening below. Damage control. People who had seen parts of the events were pulled aside. Some were formally debriefed. Others just had quiet conversations behind closed doors. A few later said they were told not to speak about what they'd seen. Not as a threat, but more like a mutual understanding. This isn't something the public needs to know. Meanwhile, Colonel Halt was writing what would become the Halt Memo, dated January 13, 1981, just over 2 weeks after the incident. The memo was sent to the British Ministry of Defense. There was never a formal statement, and no official analysis was ever released. Even today, the pages of binary remain one of the most debated parts of the Rendlesham case. To some, they're just an afterthought. To others, they're the message, the point of the entire event. But setting the code aside for a moment, what's left is this. A U.S. Air Force officer sent a memo to the British government about unexplained lights in a quiet forest. Another officer recorded those lights as they moved, split apart, and, possibly, scanned the base using tight beams of light. A trained security sergeant claimed he made physical contact with a smooth, silent object, one that left marks on the ground, burns on nearby trees, and possibly something else inside his mind. This mix is what makes Rendlesham so hard to explain. It's not one story, not one sighting, not one set of footprints. It's a layered multi-night encounter with physical traces, official paperwork, and live witness testimony, still unfolding even after 4 decades. And yet, despite the memo getting filed and the tape being safely archived, there were no public statements, no visible investigation, no teams were sent in, no conclusions shared, at least none that anyone has ever seen. Chapter 7: Military Reactions and Official Silence. The morning after Colonel Halt's forest encounter, everything on the base looked normal. Trucks crossed the runways. The dining hall opened on time. Shift rotations returned to their usual pace. But behind locked doors, the feeling was different. Officers who had once laughed off the first night's reports weren't laughing anymore. Too many voices, too much strange detail. And now, part of it was on tape. Colonel Halt returned just before dawn on December 28th. He was steady, but clearly rattled. The men with him, Lieutenant Bruce England, Sergeant Monroe Nevels, and others, all carried the same look, something between disbelief and quiet urgency. They had seen something, and it wasn't in any training manual or response protocol. Now came the hard part. What do we do with this? No alarms were raised. No immediate reports were passed to higher command. Instead, the base entered what some would later call an administrative lockdown. Word began spreading. No one was to discuss the event. All reports stayed within official channels. Nothing was to reach the media. Inside RAF Bentwaters, the base commander, Colonel Ted Conrad, reportedly reviewed the early notes from Halt, but stayed removed from the details. In military procedure, any airborne unknown, especially near sensitive sites, should have moved up the chain to higher branches like the Ministry of Defense, USAFE, or even NATO Command. But this didn't follow normal lines. There was a report, there was a tape, but the follow-up vanished. But no one seemed in a hurry to pass anything up the chain of command. While things looked calm above the surface, something quieter was happening below. Damage control. People who had seen parts of the events were pulled aside. Some were formally debriefed. Others just had quiet conversations behind closed doors. A few later said they were told not to speak about what they'd seen. Not as a threat, but more like a mutual understanding. This isn't something the public needs to know. Meanwhile, Colonel Halt was writing what would become the Halt Memo, dated January 13, 1981, just over 2 weeks after the incident. The memo was sent to the British Ministry of Defense. Its tone, cautious, clean, cold. It described what happened on the nights of December 26th to 28th, using phrases like unexplained lights and metallic object. There were no bold claims, no mention of craft, no speculation of origin, just neutral, careful words, basic military terms, no drama, no emotion. Years later, that memo would be released in the U.S. under a Freedom of Information Act request. But at the time, it was just one more report in a system that often ignores anything it can't label. Outside the memo, nothing else was made public. No military alert, no aircraft launched, no sightings on the record. Radar logs? If they existed, they were never shown. It was like the base, together, decided to put the whole thing into a box labeled unknown, and then file it away. But behind that silence, questions were building. Why multiple nights of lights? Why did equipment fail near the sightings? Why did radiation spikes show up in the landing spots? Word eventually reached London. Halt memo was received by the Ministry of Defense. It was reviewed, quickly, then archived. Their official response, later sent to the press, was a single phrase: no defense significance. That sentence would follow the Rendlesham case for years. To many, it sounded like a gentle way to shut it down, a formal shrug. It was reviewed, quickly, then archived. Their official response, later sent to the press, was a single phrase: no defense significance. That sentence would follow the Rendlesham case for years. To many, it sounded like a gentle way to shut it down, a formal shrug. But inside the base, silence didn't mean people forgot. Men who were there still remembered, clearly. Some didn't talk until retirement. Others waited decades. But nearly all of them agreed on one thing. Something happened in Rendlesham Forest, and no one ever gave a real answer. In the weeks that followed, base life went back to normal. Patrols returned to their schedules. The burn marks faded. So did the impressions in the dirt. But the feeling remained. Not just the memory, but the sense that something had been quietly covered over. By mid-January, reporters started to catch small signs. A local journalist heard whispers of something odd and ran a short piece in the East Anglian Daily Times. It didn't make much noise at first, but that would soon change. When a U.S. researcher named Larry Warren began speaking out, and more leaks followed, the story began to spread. Still, the military said very little. When asked for comment, they either pointed to the Halt memo or repeated that no threat had been identified. But this was a Cold War base, one filled with sensitive systems and serious responsibilities. So the idea that they had no interest in a low-flying, light-emitting object inside their own secured area, that didn't sit well with everyone. Some of the people involved would later say they were told not to take personal notes and not to speak with outside investigators. Others said they weren't pressured, but they already understood. This wasn't something to talk about. The Cold War had taught everyone a kind of professional silence, a rule that some unknowns were best left alone as long as they didn't break anything. It's worth considering what didn't happen. No forensic recovery team showed up. No high-ranking general took over. No joint alert between British and American forces was recorded. The case quietly slid into an unofficial category, unsolved, unconfirmed, important, but best forgotten. To this day, the UK government still says the Rendlesham case was checked thoroughly and showed no threat to national security. The US government, when asked, rarely says anything at all. But for the people who were actually there, the silence was louder than words. This was the military, an institution trained to respond at the slightest sign of intrusion. And yet, when faced with something it couldn't label, it didn't act. It looked away. And that silence, not just in paperwork, but on the faces of those who knew, became part of the story itself. Chapter 8. Public Leaks and Media Frenzy. It started small, just a ripple in still water. Only a handful of people truly knew what had happened. A few had seen the lights, a few had read the memo. Even fewer understood how strange it really was. But secrets don't survive when too many people start asking quiet questions. By early 1981, rumors of the Rendlesham incident had started to edge past the gates of RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters. A local reporter for the East Anglian Daily Times heard about strange activity near the forest during the Christmas holidays. The first article ran like a curiosity, a short piece with a title like UFO sighted near Suffolk base. No names, no bold claims, just a seed planted. That story might have been forgotten forever, like so many other local legends, if not for one thing: the leak of the Halt memo. Someone, no one knows who, even today, passed a copy of the memo to a UFO researcher in the US. That researcher later filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and by 1983, the official memo was released. It was real. It was signed. It was official. And yet, it didn't sound like science fiction. That's when the story changed. This wasn't just some rumor, not just tales from an airman with a wild imagination. This was a real military document, summarizing multiple nights of objects, lights, strange movements, and physical evidence, all inside a NATO airbase. The release of the memo acted like a pressure valve. Suddenly, the Rendlesham case wasn't just a strange local whisper. Now it was international. News outlets across the UK began picking up the story. The BBC aired a segment, and newspapers started calling it Britain's Roswell. For the first time, the public was hearing direct confirmation. Something unexplained had happened in the quiet pine woods of Suffolk. What came next was a full-blown media frenzy. UFO groups jumped into action. Researchers began arriving at the forest, some with permission, others without. They interviewed witnesses, gathered field data, and sometimes stepped onto land next to the base. Some even reported finding radiation or burn patterns that hadn't been in the original records. Suddenly, dozens of versions of the story were in circulation. A few were backed by interviews and solid research. Others leaned heavily on drama. And through it all, the Ministry of Defense stuck to its one repeated phrase: the incident was of no defense significance. That sentence became both a shield and a trigger for the public. To many, it sounded like an excuse. If there truly was no significance, they asked, why was the halt memo written? Why did the base stay quiet for weeks? Why were witnesses hesitant to speak? As pressure grew, reporters began tracking down people involved. Some, like John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, agreed to limited interviews. They spoke about it. Lights inside the woods. Odd patterns of movement equipment that started malfunctioning. Penniston began to speak more over time, talking about strange time gaps and eventually his memory of binary code. But even then, the tone stayed mostly measured. They were military men, trained professionals. They spoke carefully, not chasing headlines, not exaggerating. Others refused entirely. Some referenced secrecy agreements. Others just didn't want to be labeled. Back in the 1980s, UFO still came with a heavy stigma, especially for someone in the military. Even the idea of being open to belief could risk someone's career or credibility. Still, the media pushed forward. Tabloids took the story next, with louder headlines. Aliens in Suffolk. U.S. base invaded by UFOs. The night the sky fell. These pieces blurred the line, mixing real reports with entertainment-ready exaggerations. Some included quotes from actual accounts. Others added myth and mystery until they barely resembled the original events. Then, television followed. Rendlesham was soon featured in documentary specials, late-night talk shows, and later, mainstream news viewers were drawn in not just by the tale, but by the credibility behind the sources. These weren't farmers pulling a prank. These weren't late-night hikers with blurry photos. These were trained Air Force personnel on a restricted basis, reporting something they could not explain. But as the volume rose, so did the confusion. Competing timelines began to appear. Some researchers said the events happened on different nights than the official record. Others argued that the team didn't see just one object, but several, each different in size and behavior. Witness stories started to contradict, not always on purpose, sometimes just due to memory, time, or retellings. But it all added to a growing cloud of confusion. Soon even the forest itself became a kind of character in the story. Reporters and researchers visited Rendlesham Forest and spoke of its strange atmosphere. Some claimed their compasses malfunctioned. Others said they felt watched or uneasy. A few dug into the forest floor looking for proof. Long buried, if it ever existed at all, these woods, once quiet and forgotten, became a kind of pilgrimage site for the curious. Then came the documentaries. Both the BBC and ITV made specials, interviewing key witnesses, analyzing the halt tape. American networks followed. Unsolved Mysteries, and later, Ancient Aliens picked up the Rendlesham case, each show adding their own spin. The story had jumped from classified reports to global pop culture, and yet, even with all the attention, the military wouldn't move. Every new request for follow-up reports, radar records, or deeper details was answered with the same response. No threat detected. No investigation was ordered. No concern from higher-ups. But that very lack of concern became its own mystery. If it was nothing, why all the silence? Public interest spiked again in the 1990s. More witnesses stepped forward. Some shared new claims, symbols on the craft, mind-to-mind communication, even reports of strange health effects. But other former personnel pushed back, arguing these newer additions clouded the original truth. Now Rendlesham was stuck somewhere between memory belief and media distortion. What had started as a clear, well-documented story was turning into something else, a myth being created in real time. And yet, beneath the chaos, the basic facts wouldn't go away. Multiple nights, multiple witnesses, physical evidence, a live military response, a formal memo, never investigated. The Rendlesham case was no longer a checkbox in an old defense file. It was a global conversation, argued, filmed, debated, and clicked by millions over the years. And through all the noise, one thing remained the same: a quiet forest in Suffolk, and the men who once stood between its trees, watching something unidentifiable move through the dark. Chapter 9. The Debunkers Arrive. By the late 1980s, the Rendlesham Forest incident had become one of the most talked about UFO cases in the world. With media attention came pressure, not just for answers, but for closure. That's when the skeptics stepped in. But their goal wasn't to deny something had happened. It was to explain it, to turn the strange into the ordinary. The first and most well-known theory came from just a few miles away from the forest, the Orford Ness Lighthouse. That lighthouse stood along the Suffolk coast, a few miles east of the base. Its beam rotated on a fixed cycle, shining across the horizon every 5 seconds. Skeptics argued that under the right conditions, fog, shadows, darkness, mental stress, the beam could easily appear as a flashing light deep inside the woods. From certain angles, it could even seem to stand still or hover. Some said this perfectly matched the red and white flashing lights described by John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. Others tied the lighthouse to the second night, suggesting this was the same light Colonel Halt recorded on his audio tape. Another theory pointed to bright stars, especially Sirius, one of the brightest in the winter sky. The theory claimed that, under stress, a bright star, seen through tree branches, could appear to move or pulse as visual distortion played tricks on the eyes. This explanation became popular with astronomers who analyzed the case years later. There were even claims of hoaxes. One former airman said a small group of base personnel had set up the lights to prank the security teams. Flashlights, flares, even painted balloons were part of the story. The suggestion was simple: that trained military professionals had been fooled by a joke. These skeptical arguments were presented on TV shows, in newspaper opinion pieces, and later in full-length books. The story evolved from a mystery to a misunderstanding, with explanations like a lighthouse, a bright star, overactive imagination. But not everyone agreed, and for good reason. First, there were multiple witnesses across multiple nights. Many reporting movements that didn't match a lighthouse. This wasn't one fleeting light in the distance. Some reports, like Penniston's, describe seeing a solid object up close, on the ground. Whether or not his later claim about binary code was accurate, his original report described a craft, not a distant light source. Second, there's the radar data. Some retired air traffic personnel claimed that unidentified objects were tracked on radar systems near the base during the nights in question. These records were never made public in full, but multiple insiders independently confirmed radar hits that didn't match known aircraft. Third, the halt tape itself challenged the lighthouse theory. On the audio, Halt and his team clearly described lights moving between the trees, changing direction, and triggering compass interference. There's even mention of a metallic sound, something not explainable by a lighthouse rotating miles away. And finally, the radiation levels at the site remained above normal, with readings strongest inside the triangular landing marks. That's not something flares or stars can leave behind. As these details conflicted with the explanations, the debate began to heat up. Rendlesham was no longer just a case. It was a battle between two worldviews, those who sought closure and those still seeking the truth. In newspapers, on talk shows, and within academic circles, two narratives began to dominate. One explained Rendlesham as a case of misperception and suggestion, guided by stress and group psychology. The other suggested genuine contact with something unknown. Even the UFO community itself became divided. Some researchers leaned hard into the extraterrestrial theory, calling Rendlesham a smoking gun, undeniable proof. Others urged more caution, warning that exaggeration could ruin the credibility of the case. They pointed back to the basics: the memo, the audio tape, the physical indentations, and they asked others not to embellish beyond what was actually recorded. Meanwhile, critics accused both sides of ignoring inconvenient facts, of choosing data that supported their version and leaving the rest out. And somewhere in that standoff, a third possibility emerged. What if the confusion wasn't natural? What if it was built on purpose? Some began asking, what if the military didn't just ignore the sightings, but helped create the chaos around them? The theory said that leaking half-truths, making contradictory statements, and delaying documents could all serve one goal: bury the real event under so much noise that it became just another unsolved rumor. This wouldn't be new. In other past incidents, including some in the US, military agencies had been caught using Project Blue Book-style tactics. Let just enough get out to satisfy curiosity, but never allow the core truth to surface. In Rendlesham's case, the lack of follow-up, denials from the Ministry of Defense, and stonewalling of requests added weight to the theory. Some even believed the release of the halt memo itself was a controlled leak, enough to stir interest, not enough to answer anything. Supporters of this view pointed to how easily the case had been diluted. Too many versions, too many storytellers, too many contradictions. And once that pattern takes hold, no single truth can win. If the goal was to bury something in confusion, then maybe it worked. Years later, even the original witnesses voiced frustration, not just at the skeptics, but at the community that built itself around the event. Both John Burroughs and Jim Penniston spoke in interviews about having their memories questioned, their credibility attacked, and their experiences reinterpreted by others. They felt like participants in a story that had spiraled beyond their control, a story that no longer belonged to them. To skeptics, this was proof that memory itself is unreliable. To believers, it was evidence that something worth hiding had been seen, and that the pushback was deliberate. In the end, the arrival of the debunkers didn't resolve the Rendlesham story. It expanded it. Every explanation sparked a rebuttal. Every book or article led to letters, forums, and sometimes even threats. The case didn't fade away, it fractured. And through all the speculation, one fact never changed. Something happened. Lights were seen. Objects were described. Measurements were taken. Yes, lighthouses, stars, and hoaxes might explain some pieces of the puzzle, but not all of them. And as the years passed, the forest stayed quiet, but the argument around it only grew louder. Some described anxiety. Others admitted there were memory gaps. A few simply said, "I try not to think about it." The events in the forest weren't the end of anything. They were the beginning of long unspoken struggles with credibility, memory, and the silence that followed. In 2010, many of the surviving witnesses quietly gathered at Rendlesham Forest for a small private reunion. There were no cameras, no stage, no speeches, but it mattered. These were men who hadn't seen each other in decades, each shaped, either deeply or barely, by what had happened, or what hadn't, depending who told the story. There were still no clear answers that day, just overlapping memories, stories that matched in some places and differed in others. But in the silent space between pine trees, the weight of the past felt closer again. One man had brought his grandchildren. Another stood nearer to the tree line, scanning the horizon, as if still waiting for the lights to return. Not everyone agreed on what had happened, but most agreed on this. The experience had changed them, not just at that moment, but for a lifetime. Some dealt with mental health struggles. Others distanced themselves from the entire UFO topic. A few chose to embrace it, hoping their voices might still mean something to someone else searching. Even Colonel Halt's, once careful and neutral, began to sound more certain in later years. In multiple interviews, he said, "This was not a lighthouse. This was real." For him, the ongoing denial of official involvement became the larger mystery. If nothing happened, then why were so many files still sealed? Why did it take so long to accept even basic medical claims tied to the event? The answers never came, but the stories? They kept coming back. Retold in books, podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube videos. Each added a new frame, a new voice, a new generation of listeners. With every retelling came the same central tension: truth versus perception. What had the men really seen? What had they remembered over time? And what had they been allowed to know? Some researchers have suggested that trauma, especially in intense, high-pressure environments, doesn't erase memory, it reshapes it. The Rendlesham witnesses, they say, weren't inconsistent. They were transformed by the very thing they experienced. Not lies, but fractures in time, memory, and thought. Others keep it simpler. They say it was just a strange light that grew into a story too big to hold. A story built piece by piece, until no single version could never be completely trusted. For Burroughs and Penniston, the story never got easier. Recognition came late, when it came at all. Their names were repeated, quoted, disputed, but rarely did anyone ask what it felt like to carry a story that no institution wanted to confirm and that no community could fully agree on. For them, Rendlesham wasn't a legend. It wasn't folklore. It was personal. It happened when they were awake, in uniform, on duty, with orders in hand and eyes wide open. And the experience didn't end when they left military life. It followed them into hospitals, into interviews, into notebooks, audio tapes, and questions that still have no answers. And maybe that's what has made Rendlesham endure. Not just the lights or the binary or the tape, but the people, the ones who lived it, who never asked to be part of history, but found themselves written into it anyway. Chapter 11: New Evidence and the Binary Puzzle. By the 2010s, Rendlesham Forest had become more than just a quiet patch of woods. It was a symbol, a place where government secrecy, personal memory, and the unexplained had collided. New voices began to emerge, and with them came new angles, adding unexpected depth to a story already layered with complexity. Much of this renewed interest focused on one man, Jim Penniston. Decades after the incident, he revealed something he said he had kept private, even from other witnesses. He claimed that during his encounter, when he touched the craft that first night, he experienced a kind of mental download. A rush of information, not in images, not in language, but in binary. Long sequences of ones and zeros that surged into his mind as if they had to be written down. According to Penniston, the code wasn't part of his thoughts. It simply arrived, vivid and unshakable. For years he kept it quiet. The notebook filled with tight columns of digits sat unread. But in 2010, as the 30th anniversary of the event approached, he released scans of the original pages. The strings of numbers stretched across several sheets, dense, repetitive, and immediately intriguing. Drew attention. Computer coders, linguists, and theorists from across the UFO research world began studying them. One of them, Nick Siski, volunteered to decode the sequence using basic binary to ASCII conversion. What emerged surprised even skeptics. A series of English phrases appeared, embedded right in the digits, as if someone had encoded a full message using a simple but deliberate method. The decoded message read, "Exploration of humanity. Continuous for planetary advance. Eyes of your eyes. Origin year 8100. Beneath the text was a list of geographic coordinates. When mapped, they didn't point to random places. They matched ancient, sacred, or mysterious sites, including Giza, Egypt Nazca, Peru Sedona, Arizona Mount Tai, China, the Temple of Apollo in Knossos, Greece. But one location stood out above the rest. A lesser-known coordinate placed a marker just off the coast of Ireland, the supposed location of High Brazil. a mythical island appearing on old navigation maps as a place seen only once every 7 years. A place steeped in legend, and until now, never included in any document like this. Often called the Irish Atlantis, High Brazil was said to be hidden by mist, visible only once every 7 years, and home to an unknown but advanced civilization. It was myth, folklore, but now it had reappeared not through legend, but through a string of binary code, decoded from a UFO encounter that happened 30 years earlier. That connection alone set off a new wave of speculation. Books, podcasts, and video essays followed. Theories took shape. Was the Rendlesham object sharing a message not just with the military, but with the timeline of history itself? Could this be a trace of something ancient, an intelligence that had been watching far longer than civilization had existed? Others urged caution, not because the binary code was necessarily fake, but because its timing raised questions. Skeptics noted that Penniston's claim about receiving the code surfaced years after the original sighting, at a time when public interest in Rendlesham was starting to rise again around its anniversary. Yes, the notebook was dated to 1980, but those exact binary pages couldn't be independently verified as having been in it at that time. The idea that they might have been added later couldn't be ruled out. Even psychologists weighed in. They pointed out a known cognitive effect. In high-stress, traumatic events, the brain often reshapes memories after the fact, sometimes turning simple events into symbolic ones as a way of processing the experience. Could Penniston truly believe he received a message, even if the code came later through unknown subconscious pathways? But others asked something different. Even if the code emerged after the event, where did the message come from? The content felt off-center, unusual. Phrases like, "eyes of your eyes" weren't part of any standard linguistic model. Not random, but not quite human either. The inclusion of precise GPS coordinates gave the message weight. This didn't sound like a casual hoax, not the work of someone guessing. And the reference to origin year 81001 left some wondering, whatever this was, it wasn't from here or now. Within the UFO community, the binary code became one of Rendlesham's most polarizing elements. For some, it was the smoking gun, a signal, a quietly delivered, non-terrestrial communication. For others, it was a rabbit hole, a distraction from the parts of the case that could still be measured, corroborated, and verified. For some, the binary code was an unwelcome distraction, an unnecessary complication that pulled focus away from the stronger, more grounded elements, the multiple trained witnesses, the halt tape, the physical marks left in the clearing. Then came the new witnesses, not of the original night, but of the aftermath. In the 2010s, former radar operators, security teams, and support staff started coming forward with quiet accounts. Their stories were small, but consistent. Radio chatter spiked during the event certain equipment failed. High-ranking officers gave direct orders not to talk. One anonymous source, later featured in a documentary, claimed that U.S. intelligence agents had arrived within 48 hours of the incident and began interviewing key personnel. Another said they witnessed logs being pulled from radar control rooms and removed under orders. None of it could be proven beyond dispute. But these new voices added texture to the one question that kept coming back. Was something being covered up? Not to hide it from the public, but to keep it controlled even from those inside the system? The topic of disinformation returned. Only now, the silence had a new shape: strategic confusion. Some theorists suggested that the inconsistencies weren't an accident. The conflicting reports, the timelines that didn't quite fit, the wild turns in the media. Maybe it wasn't chaos. Maybe it was containment. If the story stayed messy, it would never become public fact, never become actionable. And over the years, the fog thickened. Still, the binary code remained, printed in books, posted in forums, passed around UFO panels, etched into the Rendlesham timeline as something that couldn't be ignored, but couldn't be proven either. To Jim Penniston, the message was always real. Belief didn't seem to matter. He had spent decades carrying it, writing it down before he understood it, and offering it not as proof, but as a piece of the experience. To him, it was a message, not from aliens, not necessarily from the future, but from something, watching, waiting, or maybe just reminding us that we're not as alone or as grounded as we like to believe. And for Rendlesham, that meant the case had never closed. It had evolved. New documents kept getting released through declassification requests. Old witnesses spoke again, some with new details, others simply no longer afraid. And new generations, younger, more curious, less skeptical, were finding the story and asking the same questions, not to turn it into a myth, but because the truth, it had simply never been allowed to come out. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Rendlesham. Rendlesham Forest is quiet now. The trees shift gently in the Suffolk breeze. Narrow paths once worn down by military boots have been softened by moss and fallen leaves. To anyone visiting today, it's just another peaceful stretch of English woodland. Serene, rural, unassuming. But beneath that silence lingers something else. Not quite a haunting, but a resonance. A question that never fully settled. More than 4 decades have passed since those nights in December 1980, and still, no official explanation has closed the case. There has been no final report, no declassified document that puts the matter to rest. Instead, Rendlesham endures, a case unresolved, continuously studied, and endlessly debated. It remains the most significant and well-documented UFO encounter in British history. What makes Rendlesham unique isn't just the lights in the sky or the strange object in the woods. It's the structure of the case. Multiple trained military witnesses, physical evidence on the ground, a real-time audio recording, internal memos, and a chain of command reacting to something they couldn't explain and couldn't fully deny it. Unlike a blurry photo or a lone civilian report, Rendlesham took place inside the boundaries of a NATO base, under security, protocol, and orders. In that sense, it occupies the same space in the UK that Roswell holds in American UFO lore. But where Roswell has been softened by myth, blurred by decades of retellings, Rendlesham remains tactile. This isn't just folklore, it's typed memos, transcripts, tape hiss, and testimony, saved in archives, released through FOIA, and still revisited across generations. It didn't happen in the desert. It happened under trees, on military time, with people who still walk among us. When compared globally, Rendlesham becomes even more compelling. The Phoenix Lights of 1997, seen by thousands, were dismissed as military flares. The 2004 Nimitz encounter, chronicled by Navy pilots and radar, had no ground interaction, but Rendlesham had it all: boots on the ground, sustained observation, physical evidence afterward, and Colonel Charles Halt's live recording, one of the only real-time audio documents from a military UFO investigation in history. And yet, despite all this, still no disclosure. Rendlesham sits in a strange limbo, too solid to dismiss, too strange to explain, and too inconvenient to pursue. For years the question remained, will the truth ever come out? Some hold out hope. They point to the recent U.S. disclosure movement, with whistleblowers, task forces, briefings, and hearing that have brought unidentified aerial phenomena into the official record. If that trend continues, they argue, Rendlesham will eventually be revisited, with new tools, new context, and new courage. Bothers aren't so sure. They believe Rendlesham was never ignored. It was studied, filed, classified at a level no one outside will access. They suggest this isn't about truth anymore. It's about control. If something truly unknown entered airspace above a joint nuclear military base twice, and nothing could stop it, then admitting that isn't an act of honesty. It's an admission of vulnerability. And governments don't take those lightly. In the years since, the key figures have grown older. Some still speak, attending panels, interviews, documentaries. Others have gone quiet, tired of testing memory against mistrust. To men like Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, Rendlesham wasn't a mystery. It was a wound, a moment that divided time into before and after. The forest has changed too. Visitors now walk a sign trail marked the UFO path. Educational boards display diagrams and eyewitness quotes. A replica of the craft even stands quietly along the way. Tourists pose, students pass by. It all seems so peaceful, almost quaint. But for the men who were there in 1980, the trees still carry weight. Memory clings to the bark. In the end, the legacy of Rendlesham doesn't live solely in what was seen, but in what it meant. To some, confirmation. To others, confusion. But most of all, a benchmark. A case that refuses to fully close, that demands curiosity, and endures because it wasn't digital. It was cassette hiss, handwritten notes, and the unchanging tone of those who witnessed it, again and again, for over 40 years. Will we ever know exactly what happened? Maybe not. Maybe it was never meant to be solved. Maybe the value of Rendlesham isn't in the answers we're missing, but in how it forces us to ask better questions. Because belief isn't weakness, and skepticism isn't cowardice. The pursuit of truth doesn't live in certainty. It lives in the space between, in careful thought, in open minds, in quiet wonder. In the end, Rendlesham reminds us of something simple, that no matter how rigid our systems, how structured our routines, or how strong our sense of control, there are moments when the unknown breaks through, just lights in the trees. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. Thank you for joining us tonight, dreamers. The Rendlesham Forest incident remains one of the most mysterious UFO encounters ever recorded. But what do you believe happened that night? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. We hope this story helped you relax and we look forward to sharing more from our Unknown series next time. Until then, sleep well.